We all have those things we think we know for sure, like the sun's going to come up tomorrow. If I drop this, it's going to fall. Basic stuff, right? But what if someone came along and said, hold on, how do you really know any of that? Today, we're diving into the mind of a guy who did just that, David Hume. And honestly, the sources you guys sent in, this stuff's gold. It's like a direct line to this philosopher's world.
It really is.
Right.
We're talking about someone who fundamentally changed how we think about, well, thinking itself.
Yeah.
And what's great about what you've chosen is it gives us this solid base for really digging into how Hume pulled that off. I think our mission here is to get to the heart of his ideas. Like, what did he think we could actually know? How did he even get there? And why does it still matter now, centuries later? All that without getting lost in the super technical weeds.
Totally. We want to make this stuff accessible, right? So no philosophy PhD required. Let's jump in.
One thing that really struck me from your sources was this. Hume straight up admitted to what a lot of people back then would call like theological failings, meaning doubts about God. You got to put yourself back in that time. Think Socrates, right? Questioning religious dogma could get you in some serious trouble.
Oh, yeah. Big time. You could get yourself killed for that. It was dangerous. The texts really hammer home how risky even hinting at atheism was for centuries. Philosophers had to walk this tightrope, making sure their ideas didn't stray too far from what the church or whoever was in charge deemed acceptable.
But here's the thing, and this is where it gets super interesting. By Hume's time, 18th century Britain, the backlash against him wasn't like off his head. It was more of a philosophical debate, arguments and rebuttals. And that tells you a lot about how things were changing. A little more tolerance, maybe. And also, to Hume's credit, the sources make it clear that he was just brutally honest. Given what he believed, there wasn't really another way for him to be. Right, he couldn't exactly hide his skepticism.
Yeah.
And to fully grasp how radical that was, it helps to look back at the philosophers who came before him. Hume didn't just invent skepticism out of nowhere.
Yeah, good point. Your sources lay out this whole lineage. Even in ancient Greece, you had some Stoics and Cynics, kind of flirting with doubt. But even someone like Socrates, brilliant as he was, still got in hot water with the authorities for his questioning. And don't even get me started on ancient Rome, emperor worship. You did not want to rock that boat. So yeah, for a long time, playing it safe, towing the line, that was the way to, well, stay alive.
And then Christianity becomes this dominant force, and philosophy, in a lot of ways, gets absorbed into theology. You see these elaborate attempts to prove God's existence through logic, but the basic religious assumptions were rarely challenged. It's funny, because thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, their ideas were almost treated as scripture themselves, even though they came from a completely different context.
Right, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, philosophically speaking. Then boom, the Renaissance hits, things start to shift. And by the 17th century, you've got Descartes. Huge figure, basically said, let's wipe the slate clean and start from scratch. What can we know for sure? And his answer was, I think, therefore I am. That was his bedrock. From there, he built this whole rationalist system, right? Reason was king.
Absolutely. Descartes was all about reason as the primary source of knowledge, which makes what happens next even more interesting. Just a few decades later, you get John Locke, and he's all about empiricism. He's saying, hold on, our knowledge comes from experience, from our senses, not just sitting in a room thinking really hard.
Locke believed we're born with this blank slate, and everything we know comes from what we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, our perceptions. It's a pretty radical shift, right? From pure reason to let's go out and experience the world. But hold up. The story doesn't end there. Enter George Berkeley, an Irish philosopher who took Locke's ideas and went in a totally wild direction. He basically asked, if all our knowledge comes from experience, how do we know the world even exists when we're not looking at it? And his answer? It exists because God is always perceiving it. One of your sources calls it a philosophical conjuring trick.
It was, wasn't it? And honestly, it was a clever move, at least for its time. It kind of patched up some holes in empiricism, but the material you sent makes it clear that it was, well, a temporary fix at best. This is where our main man, David Hume, steps onto the stage.
And with Hume, as one of your sources put it so well, we get a philosopher whose ideas still feel incredibly relevant today. You read the ancient Greeks, and it's like amazing foundational stuff, but it can also feel kind of like, beautiful mythology, medieval thinkers, often totally alien to how we think now. Even Descartes and the early empiricists, sometimes they can get a bit too caught up in their own, assumptions. And a lot of philosophers who came after Hume, they kind of fell into similar traps, trying to build these grand systems. There's this bold statement in one of the texts you shared, saying that what it just tried to do, reduce philosophy to ruins, is exactly what Hume achieved.
Whoa. That's a powerful way to put it. And I think it really does capture the earthquake Hume caused in philosophy. He took empiricism, that idea that knowledge comes from experience, and pushed it to its absolute limit, even further than Berkeley. Hume said, look, the only things we can be really sure of are our own immediate perceptions. You call these impressions. Think of it like the feeling of the sun in your skin, the taste of chocolate, the sound of a bird singing. Those are impressions, vivid, direct experiences. Then you have ideas, which are like fainter copies of those impressions, memories or thoughts about them. And Hume's big point was that every simple idea we have, it all goes back to some simple impression. Sure, we can combine ideas to come up with complex ones like a unicorn, but the foundation is always an experience. In this line of thinking, you follow it all the way through, and it leads to a pretty wild conclusion. Solipsism, the idea that the only thing you can really be sure of is your own mind. Everything else, the whole external world, might just be a figment of your imagination. It's like philosophy's ultimate dead end. Checkmate.
It's mind-blowing, right? But here's the catch, and your source points this out beautifully. It doesn't actually change how we live. Even with all these profound doubts about the nature of reality, we still act as if the world is solid, as if cause and effect work the way we think they do. And Hume himself, by all accounts, was this super down-to-earth guy, loved his food, enjoyed company. He didn't walk around like he thought everything might vanish at any second.
Yeah, there's this incredible tension there. Hume was highlighting the shaky ground beneath our feet, so to speak. We think we know so much, but a lot of it's based on assumptions. And those assumptions usually work pretty well, but still, it's kind of unsettling when you really think about it. It's like how we deal with modern science. Think quantum physics or relativity. They describe a reality that's so bizarre, so counterintuitive, that it basically breaks our everyday understanding of the world. But we accept it, right? Subatomic particles can be in multiple places at once, time is relative, all that crazy stuff, and yet we still go about our lives using a much simpler Newtonian view of the world. Things fall down, not up, and we're good with that, even if the deeper reality is way more complicated. Hume was kind of pointing to that same idea, this gap between what our reason might tell us and how we actually experience the world.
And even though Hume seemed to be pulling the rug out from under science, the source points out that he was a huge fan of Isaac Newton and the whole scientific method. He saw it as this incredible tool for uncovering truth about the world. It's almost like Hume's idea of impressions, those vivid sensory experiences, might have even been inspired by something Newton wrote about light and how it creates sensations of color. Hume respected the rigor of science, the experiments, the observations. He thought that was the way to make real progress.
But there is this fascinating paradox to unpack here. You've got Hume, who respects science, and yet his philosophy kind of takes us back to this pre-Copernican view of the universe. Remember, Copernicus showed that the Earth wasn't the center of everything. But with Hume's solipsistic empiricism, you're putting the individual back at the center of, well, whatever is actually happening, even if it's not technically universe in the way we normally think about it, at least not one that we can know for sure.
It's like with Berkeley, God was the cosmic babysitter, keeping the world running when we weren't looking. But with Hume, there's no such guarantee. There might not even be a world to keep running. It's all just our perceptions, right? And if things like objects, continuity, cause and effect, if all of that is just mental habit, where does that leave God? It's fascinating because your source suggests that while Hume himself might not have been a believer, his philosophy in a way points toward something almost Buddhist. Berkeley, they say, made philosophy seem absurd. Hume explained why it seemed absurd. But that didn't mean people suddenly started living their lives any differently.
Let's switch gears for a minute and talk about Hume himself. The material you sent has some great biographical tidbits. He was born in Edinburgh in 1711, came from an old Scottish family. His father died when Hume was just 3 years old. The text mentions some old psychological theories that tried to connect that early loss with, a deep need for certainty, suggesting that maybe Hume's whole philosophical system was a way to compensate for a missing father figure. But, as your source points out, those theories are, pretty flimsy.
Yeah, a bit of a stretch. Hume grew up on this pretty modest estate called Ninewells, near the Scottish border. His uncle, who was the local minister, raised him. Life back then was simple. Servants running around barefoot, basic food. But Hume himself apparently didn't remember it as a hardship at all. He went to the local schoolhouse with the other village kids, which was pretty standard in Scotland at the time. And get this, he went to the University of Edinburgh at 12 years old.
Wow. Talk about an early start. After university, the plan was for Hume to go into law, respectable profession. But his heart wasn't in it. He became a total bookworm, and philosophy just grabbed him. The source quotes him talking about this moment where a new scene of thought seemed to open up. He started to form his own ideas and envisioned creating this whole new philosophical system. Law, he said, appeared nauseous to him. So yeah, he dropped it.
Big move. I mean, ditching a stable career path to pursue philosophy, that takes guts. But all this internal conflict, it took a toll on him. He had what his doctor called the disease of the learned, which was probably a mix of depression and anxiety. And the cures back then, bitter medicine, claret wine, lots of horseback riding.
I guess that's one way to deal with existential dread. But the source points out this funny detail. Even with all that exercise, Hume actually started gaining weight. Eventually, he became that kind of portly figure we often see in portraits, which makes you wonder if some of his health issues might have had a physical cause as well. Anyway, he recovered slowly, but there were hints of these recurring bouts of mental distress later in life.
So in 1734, hoping to travel abroad and maybe improve his mental state, he left Ninewells and took a job as a clerk for the shipping agent in Bristol. On his way there, while he was in London, he wrote this super long letter to a Dr. Arbuthnot. He basically poured out all his anxieties, talking about distemper and his exalted imagination. He was constantly trying to prepare himself for bad things happening, like death or poverty. He even reflected on how some philosophers might be, overwhelmed by the intensity of their own genius. But here's the thing, he never sent the letter. 10 pages long, and he just kept it to himself. Makes you wonder if the act of writing it all down was enough to, get it out of his system.
Fascinating. And his time in Bristol didn't actually lead to the travel he'd hoped for. Things didn't work out with his employer, and he ended up back at Ninewells at age 24. Luckily, he had this small inheritance, so he could live modestly without working. And that's when he really went all in on his philosophical ambitions. He wanted to create something groundbreaking, something that would make him intellectually famous. The source even quotes him admitting his love of literary fame, my ruling passion.
And that brings us to the Treatise of Human Nature. It was Hume's magnum opus. To really focus on it, he decided to move to France, get some intellectual isolation, no distractions. And while he's there, get this, there's this local scandal. A woman, Agnes, unmarried and pregnant, accuses the absent Hume of being the father. We don't know for sure if it's true, but it adds this whole other layer to the story. Anyway, after 3 years in France, the treatise is done.
It's wild, because later on, Hume actually called the treatise a juvenile work. But it contains some of his most original and influential ideas, as your source points out. Even Bertrand Russell agreed with that. So what was the big idea? Well, Hume wanted to figure out the fundamental principles of human understanding, but based on experience. This is where his concepts of impressions, those vivid perceptions we talked about, and ideas, the fainter copies, come in. He argued that every simple idea, it all traces back to a corresponding simple impression. We can come up with complex ideas without direct impressions like, a dragon. But for Hume, the foundation was always in what we directly experience.
Okay, now for the really revolutionary part. Hume takes this framework of impressions and ideas, and he starts dismantling some of our most basic assumptions about the world, like the concept of objects. He argued that we never actually experience an object as a single, unified thing. All we have are these individual impressions, color, shape, texture, all that. Our minds then take those separate impressions and lump them together, and we call that an object. But the object itself, the thing, it's a mental construct. Same with continuity. We see events happening one after another, but we never actually experience the connection between them, the thing that makes it a continuous flow.
And then there's causation, which is probably Hume's most famous and impactful challenge. We see one event followed by another, like you strike a match and it bursts into flame. So you think, okay, striking the match caused the flame. But Hume said, hold on, all we're really seeing is that those two events happen together a lot. We never actually experience the necessary connection between them, the thing that makes the first event force the second event to happen. He's basically saying, just because something happened that way in the past doesn't logically guarantee it'll happen that way in the future. Your source has a great example, the black swan. For centuries, everyone in Europe thought all swans were white because that's all they'd ever seen. Then they discovered black swans in Australia. Boom! So Hume's not just being a contrarian here. He's challenging the very basis of how we make sense of the world, this idea that one thing has to lead to another. And that has huge implications for everything from science to, just our everyday predictions about what's going to happen next.
So Hume pours his heart and soul into this groundbreaking work, this masterpiece of skepticism. And what happens? Crickets. Your source describes this almost tragic initial failure. It fell dead-born from the press, Hume himself said. The intellectual world basically ignored him. But to Hume's credit, and the source emphasizes this, he seems to have bounced back pretty quickly. He was a naturally cheerful and optimistic guy. He headed back to Edinburgh and started writing shorter, more accessible essays on morality and politics, and those actually gained some traction.
In 1744, he tried for a more stable career and applied for a professorship at the University of Edinburgh, a chair of moral philosophy. But that's when the treatise came back to bite him. People accused him of heresy and atheism, not exactly ideal when you're trying to get a job at a university, especially back then. So, no dice. Hume was disappointed. He'd put so much effort into his philosophical work, and it just wasn't getting the recognition he felt it deserved.
So he looked for other opportunities. He ended up as a tutor to this guy, the Marquis of Annandale. Now, the Marquis had some, let's just say, challenges mentally. And during the Marquis's less lucid periods, Hume started working on his history of England. He actually got pretty discouraged and almost gave up on it at first. Then, in 1745, you have the Jacobite Rebellion. Hume was in England at the time, watching it all unfold. He was surprised how easily this small Scottish force managed to invade at first. It must have been pretty wild to witness history happening like that.
Seeing those events firsthand, even from a distance, definitely made an impact on him. He ended up losing his tutoring gig and, ironically, became the secretary to General James St. Clair, who was getting ready for a military expedition against the French in Canada. This whole episode is hilarious, actually. Your source describes this series of blunders, starting with the Duke of Newcastle, who was the Secretary of State. The guy was clueless about the whole thing, constantly changing his mind about where they were going and what they were supposed to do.
It's like something out of a Monty Python skit. The troops and ships were just hanging out in Portsmouth for months while the Duke dithered. Finally, General St. Clair gets his orders, attack the French. But not in Canada, in France. And when the general asked some perfectly reasonable questions, like what to do with the Native American trackers they brought along, the Duke was basically like, whatever, dude, not important. Then they get to Portsmouth, ready to set sail, and guess what? No maps of France. Hume even offered to draw one from memory. The whole campaign was a disaster. They had this ridiculous encounter at Lorient where the British were stuck in the rain, and the French commander was so laid back, he almost surrendered to this tiny, forgotten group of British artillerymen. I mean, talk about an education in how not to run a military operation. Hume got to see history in action, that's for sure.
After that debacle, General St. Clair got sent on some diplomatic missions to Vienna and Turin, and Hume tagged along as his secretary. His observations during these travels are pretty insightful. He was impressed by the German work ethic, but he had some, well, not so nice things to say about the people of Styria. He described them in these really unflattering terms, not realizing that their condition was probably due to an iodine deficiency. Oops.
And speaking of health issues, Hume had his own pretty scary experience while they were in Turin. Your source describes this whole episode with a high fever, delirium, hallucinations, even a near-suicide attempt where he tried to jump down a well. Luckily, the door was locked. Then he tried to grab swords from another room. It's intense, especially because Hume himself realized he wasn't in his right mind at the time. He even asked, "Do you think philosophy can serve as a proof against madness?" It makes you wonder, even the most rational mind, when faced with these primal fears of death and the unknown, it can kind of short-circuit.
Thankfully, he seems to have recovered pretty quickly from that eccentric adventure, as his friends called it. But it must have left a mark. Your source finds it especially intriguing that a committed atheist would experience such classic, almost demonic fears. It raises all these questions about the complex relationship between what we believe and how our minds actually work, especially under stress.
After all that, Hume decided to go back to his philosophy. He basically rewrote the treatise, turning the first part into a book called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and the later part into another book, An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. Funny thing is, Hume thought the Principles of Morals was his best work, but most philosophers disagree. Now, it might seem weird that a guy who spent so much time dismantling ideas like cause and effect and even the self would then write about morality.
It is a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? But in his ethical writings, Hume kind of sets aside the most radical parts of his skepticism, though he does connect it back to his overall framework. He argues that morality comes from our passions, specifically the development of compassion or sympathy. He thought sympathy could start as just an idea in our heads, but then become a real visceral feeling through experience. And for Hume, that capacity for compassion was the basis of all good moral qualities. He thought it was essential for individual happiness and for society as a whole to function well. He judged moral actions based on how useful and agreeable they were, both for the person doing them and for others. And what's interesting, as your source highlights, is that this kind of contradicts what he said about reason and skepticism. Like intellectually, we can doubt everything, but we still have to live in the world and make moral choices.
It's that gap between our heads and our hearts, right? The source points out that these ideas were influenced by Locke and his emphasis on natural rights and the social contract. And Hume's ethics went on to influence the utilitarians, guys like Bentham and Mill, with their whole greatest happiness for the greatest number thing. But there's a caveat here, and the text raises this important point. What about minorities? In a system where morality is just a numbers game, where the majority always wins, how do you protect the rights of those who don't fit in?
It's a good question. Hume probably didn't anticipate all the ways his ideas would be used and interpreted later on. Anyway, in 1752, he got appointed curator of the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh. Pretty sweet gig. It paid okay, but more importantly, it gave him access to tons of books, and that fueled his writing. He published essays on all sorts of topics: politics, art, economics. His essays on miracles and suicide were super controversial. People were not happy.
Yeah, Hume definitely wasn't afraid to stir the pot. His time as General St. Clair's secretary also gave him all these stories about historical events. That's what inspired him to write his massive history of England, which covered, like, everything from Julius Caesar's invasion to the Glorious Revolution. And get this, it was a huge bestseller. It even outsold Gibbon's famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire for a while, and it stayed popular for almost 100 years.
It's a really impressive work, not just because it was so comprehensive, but also because of Hume's writing style. He made history engaging, even funny at times. And he didn't just focus on battles and kings. He talked about culture, science, all sorts of stuff. Some people criticized him for bias, reflecting the prejudices of his time. But your source finds his cultural commentary surprisingly insightful. They highlight his remarks on Dryden, the poet, and Newton, the scientist. He was critical of both of them, but in a way that showed he really understood their work. He even suggested that while Newton uncovered these fundamental laws of nature, he also kind of inadvertently revealed the limitations of a purely mechanistic view of the world.
What our source calls a dubious honor. All of his books got put on the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books, banned. Then, in 1763, he became the secretary to the British ambassador in France. And let me tell you, his time in Paris was a smash hit. He was a total celebrity. People called him the British Voltaire.
Yeah, he was a rock star in the French salons. Pretty impressive for a guy who, wasn't exactly known for his dashing good looks. But he had this incredibly sharp mind and a really charming wit, which the French loved. He even had this close relationship with the Countess de Boufflers, though it never became romantic. Their letters hint at this deeper connection, something more than just polite society chatter.
And it was the Countess who introduced Hume to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which turned out to be a total disaster. Your source is pretty hard on Rousseau, calling him unstable and even suggesting that some of his ideas, like the general will, could be dangerous, potentially leading to tyranny.
Rousseau was definitely a complex and controversial figure. And while your source focuses on the negative aspects, it's worth remembering that he had a huge influence on Romanticism and this whole emphasis on individual feeling and expression. He and Hume were total opposites, both in their personalities and their philosophies, but in their own ways, they were both challenging the status quo.
Hume, always the practical one, offered Rousseau refuge in England when he was getting persecuted. But by that point, Rousseau's anxieties had gotten so bad he was basically paranoid. He'd be showering Hume with affection one minute, then accusing him of plotting against him the next. The whole thing imploded, with Rousseau publicly trashing Hume's reputation after he went back to France. Your source sees this whole episode as this symbolic clash between two very different ways of seeing the world, and they say that clash is still relevant today.
It's like a microcosm of the Enlightenment's internal tensions, right? Reason versus emotion, individualism versus the collective. Anyway, in 1769, Hume went back to Edinburgh. He was a celebrated figure by then, a literary star. He had this lively social circle, this group of intellectuals they called the Iterati, and he continued his long friendship with Adam Smith, the economist. Some scholars even suggest that Hume's ideas might have influenced Smith's whole invisible hand theory.
And Hume's skepticism, your source reminds us, it wasn't just about abstract philosophical stuff. He dismissed a lot of traditional theology and scholastic philosophy, basically saying it should all be burned because it was just sophistry and illusion. He also had this pretty bleak view of nature itself, seeing it as this blind, indifferent force that created beauty and ugliness with no purpose or meaning. That was some seriously radical stuff for the 18th century.
Then, in his last years, his health started to decline. He got diagnosed with a liver tumor, And being a bit of a hypochondriac, he confirmed the diagnosis himself using his own medical knowledge. People knew he was dying, and some were really hoping he'd, take back all his skeptical stuff on his deathbed. James Boswell, the guy who wrote the famous biography of Samuel Johnson, even went to see him, hoping to witness a dramatic recantation.
Yeah.
But Hume stuck to his guns. He famously compared believing in an afterlife to thinking that if you burn a piece of coal completely, you can just put the ashes back on the fire and get coal again.
Hume died peacefully in 1776, no deathbed conversion or anything. And even though he was controversial, a huge crowd showed up for his funeral. He'd become this major public figure. Your source makes this point that Hume's philosophy, even though it leads to these seemingly impossible conclusions, it's still so compelling you can't just dismiss it. And his impact on epistemology, the study of knowledge, was massive. He basically showed how shaky the foundations of a lot of traditional philosophy were.
Yeah, he really shook things up. Immanuel Kant, one of the biggest names in philosophy, said that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. Kant's whole project in the Critique of Pure Reason was to deal with the challenges Hume had raised. And then you had the German idealists, guys like Hegel, trying to build new philosophical systems. But Nietzsche, he famously said that there was more wisdom in one page of Hume than in all of Hegel's works combined. Even later philosophers, like Nietzsche himself and Wittgenstein, they had to grapple with Hume's skepticism, either finding ways around it or incorporating it into their own thinking.
So even though Hume might have, demolished a lot of traditional philosophy, the questions he raised are still with us today. Some people think those questions are unanswerable. Others maybe just try to ignore them because, let's face it, we got to live in the world, right? But they're still there, lurking in the background.
It's a powerful legacy. Hume challenged our most fundamental assumptions about reality, knowledge, cause, and effect. And he did it so thoroughly, so convincingly, that philosophy was never the same again. It's a paradox, really. His ideas can seem almost impractical, impossibly to live by, but they're still so influential.
So here's a thought for you to chew on. Could it be that Hume was right? Could it be that we can't really know anything for sure, that our everyday assumptions about the world are more like, useful fictions? And if that's true, how would that change how you live your life? What would you believe in? How would you make decisions?
Big questions, right? We encourage you all to go back to the sources you shared, look at them with fresh eyes, and see what jumps out at you now. Maybe this will inspire you to dive deeper into Hume or to check out how other philosophers dealt with his legacy, like Kant or Nietzsche or Wittgenstein. It's a rabbit hole worth going down.
And that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.